Shabbat Shalom. We start our parsha with Joseph in jail in Egypt. We know the backstory, but that's not part of this parsha, so we will set it aside. What we have is a young man in a strange country in a place of confinement. Now, we know from our own country's history and from whatever history we have read or heard about that slaves have no rights. This is part of the definition of slavery: no rights and being treated as if one has no value. This is true of ancient Egypt as well. In ancient Egypt, any misdemeanor a slave might commit was typically met with death. As with slaves in our own country, slaves were guilty by accusation. No trial was necessary. If somebody said the slave was guilty, they were guilty, and being put to death was a natural response. But although he was a slave and accused of wrongdoing, Joseph was not put to death. Strange. More strange things to come. Guilt by accusation was the norm for free citizens as well. If a person was accused of a crime, their nose was cut off to show everyone they were a criminal, and people should be wary of them. There was even a story about a city being built in a pit with a wall around it to house all those people with mutilated faces. The rationale was this: if criminals were removed from society, it would make for a better society. The example used was, if a noseless person stabbed another noseless person, it would not be a loss to society because it was criminal on criminal violence, and if one of them died, it was not a hardship. Perhaps this was the story that encouraged England to send criminals to Australia. The point here is that if free citizens would have their noses cut off for being an accused felon, Joseph's nose should have been removed. Joseph's nose was not removed. We know this because he would never have been allowed in Pharaoh's presence if his nose was cut off. He would never have been allowed to be a leader of the nation if he had a visible mark showing he was a criminal. Joseph had been accused of a crime, and yet his face was not mutilated. Also strange. The penalty for any type of sexual misconduct was to have one's genitalia removed. When Potiphar's wife accused Joseph of trying to rape or seduce her, the very least he would expect is for him to be castrated. We know this did not happen to Joseph because he fathered 2 of the tribes of Israel. Being castrated for sexual misconduct, and of course having one's nose cut off, and maybe being put in prison were fit punishments for free citizens. Joseph was not a free citizen. He was a slave and a foreigner. He should have been put to death. He wasn't. Really strange. Now, with guilt by accusation policy, one might expect the entire population to quickly lack both noses and genitalia. Due process took a while, and punishment typically was meted out before the trial. So what prevented this from happening? Trials did eventually happen, and if it was found that the accuser had slandered the accused and made false accusations, then the accuser would receive the same punishment as the accused received. It really wasn't worth it. It would lead to a noseless, genitalia-less society very quickly. However, Joseph was a slave. There was no due process for slaves, and any accusation of wrongdoing was justification for the death sentence. Why was Joseph still alive? Is it possible his master felt he was innocent? Maybe. However, taking the word of a slave over the word of one's wife is not going to lead to marital peace, harmony, and a happy home life. It could also lead to discontent among his other slaves who might feel that they had rights and these rights should be valued just as Joseph's were. Not worth the risk. And what would the neighbors think if they knew Potiphar was sparing the life of a slave accused of sexual impropriety? No matter how highly his master might think of Joseph, keeping him alive was a bad idea. Yet Joseph was not put to death. Strange. Spending in time in prison was also strange. As death, fines, and bodily mutilation were considered the normal punishments for crime. Prisons were rare in the ancient world. To see this, one need only look at the Old Testament law. There is nothing there about serving a prison sentence for any crime or sin. In fact, there's nothing biblically or archaeologically that would lead us to believe that Hebrews even had prisons that we know as we know them. The importance then of the prison sentence of Joseph is that the author of the book of Genesis is recording correct information. For Egypt was one of the few nations in the Near East that had prisons in any of our understanding of the term. The main prison of Egypt was called the place of confinement. It was divided into two parts: a cell block, like our modern prison, and barracks for holding large numbers of prisoners who were forced into serving as laborers for the government. What kinds of sentences were given to these prisoners? We know very little about specific sentencing procedures. It does not seem that the criminals were given a number of years to serve in prison. Possibly, maybe even probably, all sentences were life sentences. Just like having your nose cut off is a life sentence. In any case, some of the prisoners in the place of confinement were serving time for their crimes, as Joseph probably was. Other prisoners, however, were simply being held in prison, awaiting the decision of the government as to what their punishment was to be. In other words, they were waiting to find out if they were going to be executed. The main prison was located in Thebes, in Upper Egypt, some 400 miles south of the Nile Delta in modern Cairo. We can assume Joseph was there and not in some smaller prison because key royal officials were imprisoned there also. In our reading, the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of other prisoners, and if anything was done, Joseph was in charge of it. Record keeping in such an institution was as important to the ancient Egyptians as it is in modern prisons. We know this from papyrus records that have survived. This would indicate Joseph was literate and could not only speak fluent Egyptian, he could read and write and do math and do it well. Joseph must have done impressive work for Potiphar. For him to have given such an amazing gift to a slave. Strange. Just an amazing amount of strange things happening. However, prison is still prison, and Joseph longed to be free. When the Pharaoh's baker and butler were put in Joseph's prison, he cared for their needs, including listening to their dreams. When God gave him the interpretation of these dreams, in addition to sharing that interpretation, he pleaded with them to remember him to Pharaoh and plead for his release. Well, of course they forgot. The baker was put to death, and the butler would have done everything to put this little nasty incident behind him. Also, Joseph was both a criminal and a foreigner. There is no reason the butler would have followed through on Joseph's request until 2 years later, when the Pharaoh had a dream nobody could interpret. Then the butler remembered a Hebrew slave in the prison who could interpret dreams. I wonder what reward the butler thought he would get for remembering this. So, why am I spending so much time on these invisible years of Joseph's life? I doubt there were times Joseph looked back on them fondly. I doubt he talked about them to anyone. It was a miserable time. He was sold as a slave when he was 17 and entered Pharaoh's service when he was 30. That is 13 years of doubt and misery, of homesickness and anger and hopelessness with no possible end in sight. They were also years of incredible learning. As strange as it may be, he learned the language. He learned how to read and write and do math. He learned the culture and the customs of this strange land. He learned how to be a good follower. He learned how to be a good leader. He learned to trust God, regardless of how hopeless the situation looked. People in these types of situations tend to be more introspective. They analyze everything. They cry out to God continually, knowing that God is the only one listening, knowing that God is their only hope. While I doubt Joseph saw anything good in his situation while he was living through it, he was learning and developing tools he would need to become a world leader, the second most important person in Egypt. The temptation is to immediately jump to what happens next. You know the story, so I'm not going there. Instead, I'm going to go back and say, where is God in all this? What is God doing? Joseph was the favorite son of a wealthy tribal leader. He was present to observe how his father handled leadership. He discussed leadership with his father. He listened to his father's stories. He learned to trust and worship his father's God right beside his father. Their faith grew together. Joseph grew up knowing he was a leader. This role felt comfortable to him. Joseph grew up with elder brothers who were jealous of him and bullied him. They were not happy with him. They did not approve his relationship with their father. He grew up knowing that he could not count on them to have his back, and he didn't have their backs either. He loved them, but he could not trust them. And quite bluntly, he did a lot of things to earn their contempt. Finally, they dumped him in a pit and sold him as a slave. A counselor or a psychologist or psychiatrist would see all sorts of red flags in Joseph's family of origin. The favoritism, the jealousy, the fighting, trust issues, lack of respect, jockeying for power and tension from dad. The list goes on and on. This is not a model family. There are no perfect people here. There is no way any human could find a future world leader in this mess. But God chose to use these otherwise horrible traits and turn them into something good. God chose this family and loved this family and planned good for this family despite their messy behaviors. When Joseph joined Potiphar's house, he quickly rebuilt his family of origin. Potiphar quickly became the adoring father figure who trusted Joseph and put him in charge of everything. Instead of a multicolored coat with long sleeves, Potiphar gave Joseph an education only the sons of wealthy nobility would receive. Joseph not only learned the language and reading and writing and math, but he also learned the culture and customs of the people he lived among. When Joseph was accused of misconduct, Potiphar kept him safe. Potiphar risked his own reputation to accomplish this. Now, why would anyone do this for a slave? Clearly, Potiphar did not think of Joseph as a slave, but as a son, and made sure Joseph had all the advantages a well-born son of high standing could have. Was there anything else in Egypt? Was there anyone else in Egypt who would have decided this foreign slave boy should receive an excellent education and be protected from accusation? Or was this placement handpicked by God? From there, Joseph gets dumped into prison. This is no ordinary prison, but one where he is able to rub shoulders with people of influence. These people, although prisoners, were of such importance socially, they could not be served by a mutilated slave, but only one who was smart and physically perfect, like Joseph. It sounds like Potiphar was still thinking of Joseph as his son and making sure he was safe, even in prison. It sounds like God was continuing to work through Potiphar to not only keep Joseph safe, but to keep Jacob's family safe in the years to come, and eventually to form Jacob into a nation. Regardless of who Potiphar may have thought he was, God found in Potiphar a very useful person who loved to follow God's heart and listen to what God directed. I have no idea if Potiphar thought that he was a God believer or believed in the Hebrew God, but the Hebrew God certainly believed in Potiphar. In prison, Joseph's rough edges were sanded off, and he learned about what was going on in the nation and in Pharaoh's house. Here, God finished off his education and kept him safe until it was time to present him to Pharaoh as an answer to a problem not yet dreamed of, but of which God was very much aware and had been working on for years. It is amazing how God already knows what the problem is and is already working to solve it before we even know it happens. So, where are we in this story? Some of us are going through extreme problems and cannot see any light in the future. God knows about this and has already graciously promised to meet us there. God walks with us in this present darkness and promises to be there in the future, no matter how dark that future may appear. Some of us do not feel safe. The people and situations around us are scary and ugly. God does not choose to pluck us out of this mess, and we wonder if anything good could possibly come of it as we sink deeper and deeper into the refuse of life. Know that God is with you. Even though God may be silent, God is not ignoring you. Morning will eventually follow night. It always works that way. You are still prized and precious and very much loved. Some of us, like Potiphar, are placed in a position to help others. And the love and compassion God has placed in our hearts just flows out and blesses the people around us. Potiphar was the captain of the guard. We would call him the chief of police, given our current political situation. Some of us would not expect the police chief to be one to ensure this foreigner was kept safe. I expect in ancient Egypt, one would not expect the chief of police to be the one to ensure a foreign slave was not killed or mutilated either. Yet, Potiphar did this. Potiphar was a man of God and proclaims his allegiance to God through his actions of justice and compassion. God is full of surprises and loves to do the unexpected. Potiphar is one of those surprises. Joseph's whole life is a story of God's surprises and relentless compassion. As you walk through the coming days, know that God is still at work both in you and through you and for you. God is still full of surprises. God is still able to take the muck of our lives and shape it into something amazing. God makes light shine in the darkness, and there is nothing the darkness can do about it. There is nothing the darkness can do to overcome the light. Perhaps the reason you cannot see the light is because you are the lamp God has set up to dispel the darkness. Perhaps. Let us pray. God of the sparrow, God of the whale, God of the swirling stars, how does the creature say awe? How does the creature say praise? God of the earthquake, God of the storm, God of the trumpet blast, how does the creature cry woe? How does the creature cry save? God of the rainbow, God of the cross, God of the empty grave, how does the creature say grace? How does the creature say thanks? God of the hungry, God of the sick, God of the prodigal, how does the creature say care? How does the creature say life? God of the neighbor, God of the foe, God of the pruning hook, how does the creature say love? How does the creature say peace? God of the ages, God near at hand, God of the loving heart, how do your children say joy? How do your children say home? Amen.